Okay, hold on. Got it. Hi, my name's Natalie. Hi, I'm going to present a document today from Égale.ca. It's called Crossing the Rainbow Bridge, a resource supporting end-of-life planning and care needs of LGBTQI2S Older Adults in Ontario. The intended audience is any old person, not even an older person, any person trying to set up their own affairs or their parents' affairs or somebody's affairs that require end-of-life planning. It's really accessible to everybody. And it particularly deals with the needs of the LGBTQ. I'm just going to say LGBTQ, okay, just because it's going to be too long, adults in Ontario. And it does so in a language that's really accessible, and it's really thorough as a document. And it gives you access to resources. What type of document is it? It's a text document that is on their website. No download required, no document to open. I should probably mention at this point that it seems to be adapted for older adults with reading issues, potentially, in the sense that the letters are huge. And then you have to adjust it down or you can play with it. But it shows up huge. We tried it on 2 computers and it came out the same. So it's actually very readable as well. What else was there that I wanted to mention here? It refers in the introduction that it is intended to be an LGBTQI2S legacy toolkit. So it can be used in terms of planning one's own affairs or somebody's affairs. The authors, it is published or produced by Égale with the National Seniors Advisory Committee and Maureen Aslin from End of Life. Those are the only author, or there's no author specifically, but they do mention this in the acknowledgments in the introduction. The year of publication is 2017, and the only reason this would be important in terms of this, because let's face it, wills don't change, and the information for wills doesn't change all that fast. What does, however, is, for instance, the laws around medical assistance in dying, and there have been updates in the law since 2017. So anything they mention would probably require further checking, especially seeing as they seem to have relaxed some of the requirements for qualifying for medical assistance in dying. So that would be something to consider in terms of the date of publication. Access to the website or website. As I've mentioned, it's a document you click on on the site. You click to open the link, and then the document, and then that's it. It doesn't require a download, but you do need to scroll through the 95 pages to get to the information you require. You can't click in the table of contents to get to where you want to be. So be armed with patience if you want to go up and down through the document. The summary of content, well, to give you an idea, it has a 2-page table of content. So it's pretty explicit in what it covers. There are 95 pages plus the back page, so let's say 96. There are 9 sections, and the sections, I'll just mention them like this. I'll read through the list of the sections in case that can provide information as to content and if it applies, or if you'd be interested, if anybody would be interested in reading it. The first section concerns human rights. I was interested in reading that federal human rights and Ontario's human rights are slightly different. They don't cover the same thing. That was kind of new to me. 2, your rights in care. The third is consent and power of attorney, and it covers power of attorney in a way that is clear. It's understandable. I thought it was particularly interesting, and this is of concern to me because of where my mother's at right now. So that I found that was well explained. I had a lot of misconceptions or ideas in my head I wanted to clear up, and it did a great job of doing that. 4, tech benefits, and this goes into an interesting. It provides a paragraph generally per benefit. And it really sort of demystifies and goes through them very systematically. It's a fairly explicit section, and it gives you a really good idea of what you qualify for or not. So This is something we went through with my father, and we really wondered if we had missed out on benefits. Turns out he didn't qualify for very much at all, so we didn't miss out on anything. But it was nice to be able to find in one place all the information that pertained to that point. Advanced care and planning. This is a really good section that is quite detailed too in terms of what to take into consideration. And this one particularly mentions the LGBTQ community. So I thought that was interesting. Medical assistance in dying, then last will and testament. And finally, the last two sections, which I thought were interesting, the self-assessment checklist, which is a section that has questions that are yes/no answers. So it doesn't sort of get you to think about things. It's really, have you done this? Does this qualify? Is this included? Have you found this? And then finally, the last section is a resource section. And the resource section is set up the same way as the table of contents, in the sense that it covers each point and says, okay, social resources, financial resources, and it really sort of breaks it down. So it's actually easy to consult and find information that might pertain or be useful to you. Does anybody have any questions so far? No answer, good answer. I'm going to keep going. Who's it most, yeah, heard a voice? Most appropriate for? It is intended for individuals. Is it for the LGBTQ community exclusively? No, it's for everybody in Ontario. It's very specific to Ontario, though. It was easy to read. It's really intended for in French we say Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde. It's really for your average person. The language is not intended to be legalese or anything like that. It's really accessible. And I think that's what I appreciated. One of the things I appreciated the most. I mean, it is 95 pages of stuff to get through, and it did not feel like that. By the end of it, I was like, oh, that was like a 20, 30 page read. No, I went through 95 pages of scrolling. But it was very accessible. And the way things are explained, it's clear, it's specific, and yet you don't feel like you just went through a what? Even the way wills are explained, the need for certain things. And I particularly like little warnings. Well, warnings sounds nasty. Little sort of heads up for the LGBTQ community. For instance, it mentioned that when you're dealing with executors, you might wind up with a legal name, but you might also want to add the preferred name and pronouns. It warned of a few times about chosen families not being respected necessarily by the decision makers, the substitute decision makers, a new word I learned, substitute decision makers with capitals, it seems to be a title. Or maybe that's because I'm French and I've just never heard it in preparation for that kind of thing. So, but it doesn't just pertain to the LGBTQ community. So it's the kind of document that you could suggest to any ally in your life and say, hey, I found this really, really good resource. I know it's on, and especially if they don't know Égale, you could just say, go to égale.ca because it doesn't say LGBTQ anywhere. And they might not even notice. And if they don't know rainbow bridges and stuff like the rainbow and stuff like that, they wouldn't even clue in until they mention, it's not that easy for the LGBTQ community, or you might want to watch that, because the rest of the time, let's face it, a will and testament is a will and testament for everybody. It doesn't matter where you are. So that part was particularly of interest. So accessible to everyone. I guess I'll take questions before I go into highlights and limitations, if anything. Any comments or
just a comment, Natalie. Substitute decision maker. Now, normally, in most cases, let's say, that's the person with power of attorney. But where someone hasn't been designated power of attorney, then you'll find through the Consent and Capacity Act and perhaps some other legislation, someone can be designated as substitute decision maker for the healthcare purposes. Okay.
Yeah, the impression that I had is that the substitute decision maker is specifically the person in power of attorney and power of care, power of attorney for property and power of attorney for care. There are two different things, and this is one of the things that we've been talking about in our family. For instance, I'm the one with my mother. I'm around her. So, and I was the one around for my father. So when, for instance, he had a stroke, who went with them to the hospital at 2 a.m.? It was me. And I had no power of attorney, power of care, but my mother was with me. So I was able to make the decisions, but we piggybacked on the fact that she was there. Had I didn't have any paperwork. Mind you, as the daughter, I'm the next sort of in line to the spouse. So that wasn't super hard. However, I'm not the best at financial affairs. So my brother is the one who has that capacity, if you want. Except we don't have it on paper for my mother. For my father, we did, but not for my mother. So should my mother, say, get COVID and she has COPD, this is interesting. I'm like, Mom, we need to do this like now, because the day you're sick is not the day we start doing all this stuff. So that was my initial interest in doing this document. It was really to be able to understand, what is it we're talking about? What is it that it allows us to do in terms of decision making? And so back to substitute decision maker, it seems to be a term that is used a bit more generally and not just in the context of the power of attorneys. And so it's the term sort of used in terms of designating who will be answering or who will be accompanying you. It's just as simple as accompanying you to an appointment, or to be there, or to ask for the right to be there with your when you see your healthcare professionals. Yeah. So in that sense, it's a new term.
It's the term used specifically with respect to healthcare, whereas power of attorney really applies across the board.
And Natalie, if I can, within long-term care, we use substitute decision makers on a regular basis. A power of attorney may be within Florida, they may be other places, and so they have a recognized SDMs. So an SDM, and it's capitalized, you're quite right, and I don't know in French what that means, but so your substitute decision maker is the person who then acts in the capacity of, for the legal representative, which is the POA. If there is no POA, then it falls to the government, and they send in a substitute decision maker to make the legal aspects. So if there isn't a substitute or a POA, and many people like your mother refuse to, they don't want to think about it at that time. And it really puts the family at a difficult and precarious situation, because the whole intention behind a POA is to act on the responsibility or the choices of the individual. As substitute decision makers, they may not know what the preferences of the person are. And so for an LGBTQ, it is particularly interesting that they need to have a POA assigned. Although my one caveat to it is, make sure you pick the right person, because it's critical. Whether you get forced fed by someone or whether you're allowed to waste and die, as would be your choice, whichever your choice would be, the substitute decision maker, regardless of what they want, needs to respect you. And as an SDM, it becomes very complicated. So not that I'm trying to interject, but
Rick,
thank
your
you.
comment is particularly, your comment is interesting because it actually reaches back to something Carmen asked about. They mention when you choose your substitute decision maker, they specify that in this document. They say, watch out, make sure that not only you've communicated your information to your substitute decision maker, but in addition, make sure that this person is aware that they will have to advocate for their right to be your substitute decision maker, especially if they're not family. So if they are chosen family, if they are friends or relationships that you judge are important, they have to know that they will have to represent that to the caregivers, the hospital, whatever situation you wind up in. And so they say, be careful who you choose. Make sure that that person is aware, not just of your choices, but also of what they will have to do once in that situation. So that's a very, very valid point, right? And they do mention it. So back to Carmen's point, they mentioned this specifically. And so one thing I can mention here is they have these boxes at places for your information or for more information, and they give sort of a little watch out on this, or this is particularly interesting in this regard. Sometimes it applies to general things, sometimes LGBTQ. And so that's an interesting little sort of information blurb that shows up a few times in the document. So thanks for your interjection, Rick. That's a very, very valid point. And that's one of the ways that they reach the LGBTQ community, is by sort of giving a heads up. Oh, by the way, here they mention it with executors. That executors will often have to defend their position. They may be named, but it will often be contested, especially if family isn't necessarily on board, i.e. children who might contest the will or the choices made in the will. Then there will be, you need to be aware of this as you set up your will, and take that into consideration as you go in. Any more questions or comments?
So the thing that I would say about the process is it's far more tricky than what people truly give it enough. They don't seem to give it enough thought prior to, and often pick their smart brother who looks after the finances. That's really not that hard to do, because you can always do a forensic audit to go back to find out whether or not the money was dealt with correctly. However, when it comes to care, whether someone is literally being abused, because in many cases in care, people who are anti-drugs will then refuse a pain or an analgesic for their family member because they don't believe in it. And so I would argue extremely that on a rating of is care or finance more important to pick the right person, it is absolutely care. Finance can be gone back and you can contest it, you can fight for years, you can waste it all on lawyers. But when it comes to care, you're already dead and you're already upset or hurt or abused.
Can I use an example here, Rick?
Please.
To substitute or to add to this point, they mention at some point, for instance, that the substitute the SDM, okay, for all intents, we'll call it SDM a little faster. So the SDM, for instance, will choose housing, care needs, clothing, pronouns. So I imagine, say, a trans person, who gets put into care, and the substitute decision maker decides, you know what, this was my dad, not my mom. So this is what you're going to do. And this goes against the person's wishes in their regular previous life, in the life that they have led up until this moment. And suddenly they wind up not being able to advocate for themselves because they're no longer, that's why they have a substitute decision maker. And this person then goes by their will, not the person that they're representing. So I think that to me, that screamed in my head. I reading through the document, I was like, this is where this would make a big difference, Yep.
The other one thing that I would say is, just because you have POA or you have a substitute decision maker, it does not take away the ability of a good POA to go to the individual and ask them, because it is a sliding gray scale as to consent or ability to inform consent. So if you were asking and you did not have the individual there because they don't want to be involved, that's different. But when you're making care choices, often you need to go back to the individual to say, because you do have the right to choose whether you want to eat potatoes or whether you want macaroni. But that doesn't, even though you are incapacitated. So many people argue that because I am the power of attorney, I get to choose whether she wants potatoes. That is not.
And actually, is everything okay? Because you've jammed on your screen. Do you guys still hear me?
Rick froze.
Okay, Rick froze. Okay, good. Actually, if I can say something about this, another thing I discovered, and I'm sort of going off my script, but one thing I discovered that was of interest to me is that when you go through the capacity assessment, okay, so when healthcare professionals go through the process of determining if the person has capacity to make decisions, there's rights. There's 5 rights that they name. I have to go through my notes to find which of these 5 fight what the 5 are, but one of the things that they do say is that you have the right to refuse the assessment. That was of interest to me. Now, another thing that was of interest is that when the results come out, or when the professional, states this that they have or not capacity, it doesn't necessarily apply to everything. It can apply to specific, because the assessment is for very specific things. You can, when you can contest it, that's another right you have. But mainly what I thought was interesting is that it can apply to specific things. For instance, it can apply to your medical care, but not your housing. You may still have the capacity to make decisions on your housing needs, or on your clothing needs, or on your financial needs, but not for your care needs, healthcare needs. It doesn't necessarily apply, and maybe Rick, who has more experience in this, can confirm or infirm, but it seems that you can, the capacity assessment allows for a specific application of capacity, which I didn't know. I thought it was like you can or you can't, like a sort of black or white thing. And no, it seems to apply to various aspects of a person's life. And again, I think that this goes to impression. So if you have a sibling that comes in and says, well, I have this, or I think mom this, and there's contestation within families, and I've known people where this has happened, or families where this has happened, this can get pretty tricky, because the parent can decide for some, or the person can decide for some, but not for other things. And so that was something that I thought was well explained in the document. Yes, Dan.
And the thing is, if the substitute decision maker is pushing or wants certain things that staff in the hospital or long-term care facility aren't comfortable with either, they can actually go and request through the consenting capacity board that even the SDM is declared not competent to take decisions. And that's one of the risks as we get older, where, like we often see partners where one, in a couple, one partner has dementia, and the other is in denial, or, they've got responsibility. And so sometimes decisions end up being taken to take the responsibility to take decisions away from the designated person and assign it to somebody else. Sometimes, though, it becomes very tricky, and it looks like, well, if I agree with them, then they will deem that I have capacity to give consent. But if I disagree with them, then they will deem that I don't have capacity. And I've seen that regularly.
I think that this whole issue of consent becomes a tricky one. It was dealt with in the document fairly clearly. It was clear, but it doesn't go into detail. It sort of gives you sort of a warning or heads up on certain things, and then gives you the info, and then it stops there. The details that we're talking about are ones that we're bringing this further. But you're right, Dan, that they do mention, watch out.
Yeah. One more point, Natalie, and you were, because you were mentioning how sometimes in the family there can be disagreement. And I haven't seen it in Ottawa, but in Toronto, there are actually people who help mediate these family discussions. Actually, in Ottawa, we do have family mediators and elder mediators and things like that. But if they are a resource that can usefully be drawn on to help resolve disagreements in the family as to the care of their loved one who is, for example, in a coma. What do we do?
Well, they did mention this in the document, so they don't talk about how this might be addressed. So this sends me to one of the next points that I want to make, but this is a valid point. They send you at various points in the document through each section to links, and it suggests you can consult. So instead of going into too much detail, so this would, become the mind-blowing piece that you don't want. Before they get into too technical, what they say is, so if there's this, or should you need more information about this particular point, there is this resource, and they give you a link. Unfortunately, because it's a copied document, none of the links work. You can't click on the frickin' document to get it to open. You have to, and you can't, my computer anyway, wouldn't even copy. So I had to write it down on paper, move over, type it into my browser. So that might be one of the limitations coming up on the document. But so without going into detail, at various points in the document, they suggest that if you need for more information, go there. So they didn't mention what you were talking about, the mediation, but thank you for mentioning it.
But Nathalie, does this mean that, you know, they have all these checklists, but you can't print them off?
Well, I think you would have to print the screen, from what I understand.
Okay.
Like, I didn't try because I don't have a printer, but yeah, I guess you'd have to print, because it said view document enlarged. Oh, there might be a print function on the screen at the bottom. Now, Égale does a nice thing. So I mentioned that it came up in like huge letters, right? Like, it was to the point that I could see so little text on my screen. I was just like, what? This is scroll, 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 scroll. My arms stop, scroll, scroll, come on. So I got somebody else on their computer. I said, does it show up the same on, because I have an Apple, they don't. So I said, can you just look it up? Because I want to see if it comes up the same. Person was like, what? I'm like, just do this, please. Okay, just check on your computer. I want to see how it comes up. And then what we noticed, and it did, it came up big. So at the bottom of the screen of literally of the document, you have a little ruler that allows you to blow it up or reduce it. Relief. I was able to reduce it to the point where I could see a full paragraph on a screen. I was like, this is better. There might have been a print function there. I didn't notice it. Sorry, Carmen. I dropped the ball on that one. I did not think of the print.
No, and I think Rick wanted to say something too.
Go for it, Rick. Sound, Rick?
I was just going to mention that when it comes to dispute resolution within long-term care, Dan had raised a very good point. And there are few resources available. However, the care home itself does have an internal process, at least any I've ever worked for, or the groups. And we use our social workers. And so the social worker would come in, and especially, Dan, you had mentioned in case of palliation and near death. Often the social worker has already deeply been involved. And so you sit down with them. However, often it comes down to differences of familial ties and responsibilities, especially with half sisters, half brothers, that kind of thing. Social workers are the first venue within the long-term care sector that we use to do a dispute resolution. However, POA has authority. So in the end, if there is a POA for care who says, this is what it is, mom gets a tube feed. The care home may say, this is not what it's not what we want. What we think is the right thing for her. We don't feel this. The family says, we don't think this. And the POA says, bugger you. We're going to do it anyway. Yeah. And they do have the authority, because pick your POA is specifically for you, not for anybody else. And so, yes, there is process, but I don't know of any external groups, Dan, that would come in. And you're quite right there. Other than I have called PG&T and asked them for support. Public guardian and trustee. Public guardian and trustee, PG&T, or who comes. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to Natalie. Thank you.
They're mentioned, by the way. That is, I'm like, oh, I've heard this. They're mentioned one place in the document. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. I'd have to go through notes to find out where, but they were mentioned I think in the case of questioning executor or probate, or
if no POA has been chosen and there's no one to probate or look after the estate or look after the care, PG&T come in. However, PG&T, I'll just tell you, are the people that do not know the individual. They may have 400 people on their case list. So they always, I have never known them not to refer to the care home to say, what do you believe? And then they generally take your advice. PG&T mostly look after finance. And that's why I say, who cares about your finance? PG&T can look after that, but care for who you are, especially from an LGBTQ. It need not be a family member. You can pick your own person and hope that they survive past you,
Yep.
So
thank you. Both of you, thank you for mentioning this because that is not something, sorry, I'll get back to you in a second, George. This is something that they don't mention. They don't mention mediation. There are no resources for that either. Okay, just to know that might be a limitation of this document. They don't go into a lot, but it's also one of the things that they keep sort of, that keeps the document readable. They don't go into too much detail. They don't flood you with information. This is supposed to be sort of like your first sort of, this is all the really important information you need. After that, if you need specific information about something, that's when they send you to the extra resources. And they didn't really mention mediation, but they do mention, watch out for this. If you have issues, you need to go this. It seems a bit general, though, not specific like you guys are mentioning.
So just a point, Natalie. So I went to the site, and down at the bottom, there is a button that you could push, which is download PDF. So you can actually download it as a PDF and save it on your computer and refer to it anytime.
Good.
So then this becomes a highlight, which kind of leads me to my next session. This becomes a highlight. It means you don't need to download, which is kind of interesting if your computer is limited in terms of memory, or if you're not in a place where you can put something onto the computer. The fact that you can just access it right away might be of interest. And then the idea that you can download and print is a great addition to how you can use the text. So, hey, it makes it even more multi. I think it actually it's a very consultable, or no, that doesn't exist as a word, I don't think, but it's an easy to consult resource in that respect, and it's well done. Any other comments?
Natalie, one more point about mediation. So like across Canada, you do have the Family Mediation Canada, FMC, which would be one organization that has people who deal with family disputes, and some of them would have more or less experience in the healthcare area. In Ottawa, you've got the also, besides FMC, you've got the Canadian Institute for Conflict Resolution, and some of their practitioners also have experience in healthcare issues. But it is an area where increasingly, where it's so complicated in terms of the rules, healthcare processes and everything, and then the finances. Don't be surprised if more and more people need mediation and they're struggling to find it.
Actually, Dan, that makes me think that maybe this is something that we don't share often enough. I haven't, in all of my research, preparing our website for our group, in this, and going through our toolkit, I have not seen that anywhere.
Really?
I have not seen references to mediation and the need for mediation. And it's like you're saying, it's very specific to this need, though. I mean, when you're getting married, whether it's hetero or gay, you don't, or any involving anything different, you don't really need mediation. You do your own thing. So it's only for this. And there's nowhere that I've seen it sort of presented or a link or a resource presented. That's actually kind of interesting. And maybe something to consider for a checklist.
Yeah, and for example, like some of you may have known Brenna Riviere, R-I-V-I-E-R. She died last year, but she was a mediator and with CICR. And, you know, we need more people like that.
Valid point. Karaman, I just want to make sure that I'm not overstepping the time. Do I just have 5 minutes left?
No. Yes. Please continue.
So if you guys don't mind, I'm just going to keep going because I'd like to present the highlights and limitations. I think I presented who it's appropriate for, everybody. Highlights and limitations. So let's start with the highlights. Rick, what you mentioned earlier about the fact that it's easy, like it's accessible as a document. I think that this is one of the we go to Égale and we're thinking, oh, it's going to be heavy-duty, long. It's 90 pages. What? It's going to be legalese. I'm going to go nuts reading this. Can I really read this? Will I understand what it says? I've been to other websites and it goes into jargon so fast. What do I do with this? Not the case with this document. And actually, it's very informative. It's presented in I particularly appreciate that. It's point form. It's one after the other. It's very specific in terms of what it presents. And then when it presents it, it keeps it in language that's very accessible. I mean, you still need to know how to read. You need to be able to understand text. fairly well, but beyond that, the language isn't crazy. There's not a ton of specific language, whether it's about legal anything or care anything. It just presents it in a very concrete way. The consideration to the needs of the LGBTQ community is well done. It's not overwhelming. It's not like, if you are LGBTQ, then this. But it tends to say, by the way, in terms of this, you might find that your SDM, your substitute decision maker, will need to advocate for themselves when it comes time to represent your needs, because they might not be officially easy to recognize as your SDM. So there might be, they might have to advocate. So that was a nice little touch. Mentioning preferred pronouns and preferred names when you identify your executor, for instance, was interesting. I put as noteworthy. It wasn't so much a highlight, but as noteworthy. I like the ease of access to the document. We mentioned that it was just on the website, but you could also download it. So that makes it even better in terms of access. The fact that it was large letters means that without having to adjust your browser and change the size, it's very readable for an older population. And the controls at the bottom of the screen were easy to adjust. It. Once you saw the arrows were there, it was easy to do. In terms of the limitations, the links not being active was kind of unpleasant. Trying to, and I was like, damn it, I had to write it out. I wouldn't even copy. Had I downloaded the PDF, though, I probably would have been able to copy the text. But anyway, the need to scroll up and down the pages, especially when I wanted to get to page 72, it's like, not again. Scroll, 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 scroll. And the fact that the document, and this is maybe the most noteworthy in terms of its limitations, is the fact that the information on medical assistance in dying isn't up to date. It did confirm a few things for me. For instance, my father died, but he died of he had a degenerative disease. However, it's not a disease that people know. Like the doctors didn't even know what it was at emerged. They had to look it up while my dad was in care. And it's not a disease that kills. So my father, even though he wound up not being able to feed himself, not being able to, even at the end, he was having trouble moving his electric wheelchair. He did not have access to this because in the text that's in this document, maybe the law, I haven't checked it because he passed before this law was updated. They mentioned that you have to fulfill all the conditions that are listed in the document. And that was always one of the things is there is a 26 weeks, the healthcare professional had to attest that the person had, or am I getting mixed up? Anyway, that there's a certain limited period of time that we could expect death to happen. And that never fit my dad's profile because it wasn't a condition that killed, although ultimately he was, little by little reduced to, dying. At the end, he stopped breathing. So the fact that the document isn't updated is kind of a, okay, so I'm going to have to go find this information elsewhere. But again, they provide links. So potentially you'd be able to go find the information through their links. So I think that's it. I don't know if I gave a good picture of it, but I found it a very useful document, very accessible. If you're trying to figure out your affairs, the checklist was useful. And especially the fact that it's broken down again by section, so you can use it just per section. So it's easy to consult. Now, some little things that I wanted to mention. As I was checking the documents, the various documents to make my selection, I came up with a BC document that I thought was interesting. And ultimately, because it applied, I wasn't sure at the time where I saw this, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do in certain, I expected I was supposed to report on an LTC toolkit or to the intention of LTCs. So I was looking for something. When I hit the Égale one, I was like, aha, I found my baby. But so there's one called Planning for My Care by the Canadian Virtual Hospice. what I like about that document, and it's on our checklist, on our list, it centers around fair conversations. So it also asks questions to help you prepare your affairs, but it's like it gives you this much space to answer, and they are not yes/no questions. They're all, so what do you think something to consider would be, and it gives you examples of little answers. So that one is really focused on having a conversations with yourself or with somebody else about care and about needs and about wishes, and it guides you. The Égale document is not meant to be a guide. It's meant to be a sort of, if you need this, then this. Or, by the way, this is the information you need to be able to go ahead, and this is the structure underlying all of this. So if you want to get a certain picture of what the legal framework is around getting your shit together at the end of your life, this is your document.